favor and radical worship. So before I get started, I just want all of you to think of a time. Has there ever been a time where you were chosen for something, whether it was you were chosen first on a team? We just picked camp teams, and so some of y'all who were chosen first probably felt pretty special. Maybe you were chosen for a class officer position, or you were accepted to a college. Maybe you won a raffle. I don't know, at a football game, I know they do those raffles. Whatever it is, have you ever been called to something, your name was called out, and you felt super important? Or someone picked you and you felt super important? I know I have.
Yes, ma'am.
How did that make you feel?
Awesome.
Awesome? Chosen? Prideful? My story would be more so when I was a youth student. Lauren, this gum's going to get me distracted. I don't have to swallow it.
The purpose. What? Swallow gum?
I swallow gum all the time. I just swallowed it.
Oh my gosh.
You don't swallow gum? I swallow gum all the time. I only had a half piece. Anyways, when I was a youth student, I was a youth leader. Some of you are our youth leaders. You guys come to our youth leader meetings. And that to me was a really big role and a big thing in my life. My youth pastor basically would tell people, like, I'm his right-hand person. Anytime new students would come, they'd come see me, I'd help them. Like, I just had such an important role in my youth group that it became more of my identity. I didn't really get involved in sports and all of that. I was earlier in school, but whenever I became more involved in my youth group, that became important to me. And when he would tell people, like, this is my right-hand person, you need to go see Lindsey if you have any questions, like, I felt I felt favored, I felt important, I felt chosen, and I had a purpose. So, in this passage, we're going to talk about David and how David had his name called by God. And we're going to explain a little bit about that, but before I go into the story that we're going to speak on, I'm going to give you a little bit of backstory. First, it's been several years, so whatever I'm talking about right now, I'm just going to let you know, it's been several years since David has killed Goliath. King Saul has been killed, and now David is king over all of Israel. God promised David that he would be king, so now he's king. The Ark of the Covenant has not been in the city of Jerusalem where it should have been for over 20 years, which, if you don't know, the Ark of the Covenant represents the power and the presence of God. So that's where they met with God, was the Ark of the Covenant. So after David became king, he told the people, it's time to bring the Ark of our God back. So we're going to read in 2 Samuel 6:13-16. It says, after the men who were carrying the Ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, David sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. And David danced before the Lord with all his might, wearing a priestly garment. So David and all of the people of Israel brought up the Ark of the Lord with shouts of joy and the blowing of ram's horns. But as the Ark of the Lord entered the city of David, I'm pretty sure her name is Michal, which is weird because that's a boy name, but Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked down from her window. When she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she was filled with contempt for him. In verses 20-22, it says, when David returned home to bless his family, Michal, this daughter of Saul, came out to meet him. She said in disgust, how distinguished the king of Israel looked today, shamelessly exposing himself to the servant girls like any vulgar person might do. David retorted to Michal, I was dancing before the Lord, who chose me above your father and all his family. He appointed me the leader of Israel, the people of the Lord, so I celebrated before the Lord. Yes, I am willing to look even more foolish than this, even to be humiliated in my own eyes, but those servant girls you mentioned will indeed think I'm distinguished. So as the ark was being transported to Jerusalem, David danced before the Lord with all his might. And I know you guys have heard people say, like, dance like David danced. That's because as he's so excited and so honored that the Lord has showed favor on him and that the ark is coming back, that he just began to dance before the Lord. But this is what I want you guys to realize, because I did not realize this until as I read it. It doesn't really say this until you actually do some studying. Michal is David's wife. So that puts this whole story into a different Do you realize they're having an argument here? Like a husband-wife argument. None of y'all are married except for Lauren and Heath and me and Thomas. But let me tell you, a husband-wife argument, this is how I see it. Dude, you look disgusting dancing before all those people. Like, how dare you, as my husband, get out there and dance like that and be so shameless? You are a king. You shouldn't dance like that. And he's like, honey, what are you talking about? I will look like a fool in front of everyone. I don't care. I'm going to dance before everyone. Like, it's a husband and wife argument. It's a totally, you hit cheap shots sometimes. It's not just you're arguing with like a servant person. No, you're arguing with your wife. It's different. But she was not impressed with her husband's display of worship. She confronted David about it. Why? Because she thought that he had too much of a power, too high of authority to be able to embarrass himself like that. Michael accused David of dancing inappropriately, of putting on a show in front of others, and acting below his status, which was king. But David responded to his wife's accusations by saying, I danced before the Lord. And I did that because he chose me. He doesn't care what anybody else thinks of him. He doesn't care what others may think his status should be and what he should do, which a lot of us do. We think that, oh, well, we're Christians. We can't do this. We can't act like this. Pastor Thomas, he can't do certain things on a Sunday morning. Maybe, wear shorts on a Sunday morning. That may be a little, people might think something of it because that's not, you have a higher standard there.
Right.
But he said, God chose me, therefore I will dance in front of the Lord. Let's examine David's worship and the motivation behind his worship. Point number 1, David worshipped radically. So if you don't know what radically means, it means in an extreme manner or a noticeable way. So he worshipped so extreme that people took notice. Yeah. It says in verse 14, David danced with all of his might. He didn't just do this little, wave my hands back and forth. No, he just let go. Have you ever just, like mosh pitting, where you just let go that afterwards all your muscles hurt because you just completely gave your all? Yeah. God helped David slay a giant. He rescued him from Saul's hand. He provided for him when he was on the run. God kept his promise and seated David on the throne, and God's favor continued to remain on David. So David danced. Yeah. Yeah. David danced because he had God's favor. He did not offer God an unenthusiastic praise or a half-hearted praise. He worshiped the Lord with all his might. Yeah. So think about how God's hand has been upon your life. Has he set you free from depression? Yeah. Has he set you free from anxiety or fear or lust or pornography or insecurities? Whatever it is, has he saved you from an accident? Have you ever had a near-death experience that he saved you from? Has he showed grace upon you even after you failed? Even when you said, God, I don't deserve anything, he still showed grace and he still shown that he chose you. Did he bring certain people into your life to help guide you through certain situations that you faced? Families, whether divorced or together, whole families. Pastor Thomas and I both come from divorced families, but even in that, God has showed his favor upon us. He's brought step-parents into our lives that have changed our lives. He's brought other people in our lives, and he's used those stories as testimonies to help minister to several of you who also have gone through broken families. Those who don't have broken families, whose parents are still together, has he shown you grace in that? Has he shown his favor upon you by giving you a complete, solid family? When you realize that the Lord's favor has been upon your life this whole time, a lukewarm expression of worship to God will not cut it. And yet we do that. We give him such a lukewarm expression for all the things that he's done for us.
That's right. Mom.
Let me give you an example of a lukewarm expression. I don't want to call your worship out because it is about your purpose in it. But I see when you guys go to convention, and I see when you guys go to camp. And either this is fake or that is fake. Because you go to camp and you're giving it all, and you're worshiping like David danced, and you're throwing your hands up in the air, and some of you are spinning and jumping when they say jump and running through the crowds, but then when you get here, it's sometimes so hard for you to even lift one hand. It's so hard for you to even come to the altar. You kind of want to stay as close to the back, as close to the sides of the wall, in the sanctuary, you'd rather just stay in your pew because nobody else is in the altars on Sunday mornings except for maybe Pastor Thomas and Cayman. Like,
Right.
you'd rather just stay in your altar instead of coming down to the altars. Whereas at camp and youth convention, you're running 30 minutes before they even start.
That's right.
So again, I'm not saying one is one way, one is the other. I'm just saying either that's fake or this is fake. One of them is lukewarm,
Yeah.
and one of them is the true expression of your worship for God. Our level of worship should match the level of favor that God has on our lives. It should match. It shouldn't be uneven. It should match 100%. And you know what is so crazy about that? The reason why I think David danced so mightily and just with everything he has is because even with everything he has, he still couldn't match the favor that God had on his life.
Yeah.
He still couldn't match, but he gave everything to try to match it.
Good.
David didn't worship radically in hopes that he could earn God's favor because he was already living in God's favor. Therefore, we need to realize that we are living in God's favor right here, right now.
That's right.
Point number 2 is David worshiped for the Lord. David's wife accused him of trying to put on a show before others. And you know what? There will be people, there's always someone who's going to criticize your worship.
Right.
Yeah.
They may say, it's not genuine, it's fake. They may say, it's too loud or it's too quiet. They may say, it's too crazy, you're dancing like, everyone probably, including his wife, looked at him like he was crazy. Or they may say, it's just too tamed. You're just sitting at the altar on your knees, worshiping. Like, that's just too tame. That doesn't show God's favor. That doesn't show how much worship you have for the Lord. But that's not true. Your worship is 100% a reason, but you got to ask yourself, what's the reason for it? So maybe you are the one that's going to dance before the Lord like David. I've always liked to say, it's going out of what you consider a comfort zone. If you're stuck in your comfort zone, you're probably not giving the Lord everything.
Yeah.
How many of you have felt judged for how you worship? Be honest, raise your hand. How many of you have changed your worship style to satisfy other people? Everyone should lift their hands on that because I see it. Again, we go back to the youth youth convention, youth camp in the church. When you're in the music and all the lights are popping on your face and the bass is going and Heather Wallace is screaming, I speak Jesus. Yeah, you're like, come on, Jesus! But when you're here and Lauren's more intimate and subtle with it, still singing the same words about the same truth, about the same God, you may be more like,
Right.
Come on.
but it's the same thing. It's what is your purpose? So ask yourself, what is the purpose of my worship and who am I worshiping? Are you worshiping because of the fact that you're a youth leader? Or because you're the youth pastor? Are you worshiping because out of a title? Like, oh, I gotta worship because I'm here on Sunday morning and I don't want people to think that I don't love Jesus. Are you worshiping just because your friend is worshiping beside you? Are you putting on a show? Because, it can go both ways. We sit here and we say, you don't do anything, you just put your hands in your pocket. But then there's also people who are just like throwing their hands up and putting their hands in the air and jumping up and down, but it means nothing because they're doing it for the attention and applause of other people.
Come on.
It goes both ways.
Yeah, that's good.
Yep.
Sometimes it will be the people who are the closest to you, those who know you the best, that will try and judge the authenticity of your worship. David was not concerned at all with what anyone thought of him, even his own wife. The opinion of his wife was not going to deter him from giving God what God deserved. David's motive was not to impress or to show off for anyone. He only wanted to please the Lord.
Yeah.
Don't allow the fear of people saying that you're fake, that your worship is fake, to stop you from worshiping God. Trust God with your motives and let other people think what they want to think. And I know that's super hard. I'm a people pleaser. If I find out anyone has anything about me, I want to fix myself. I want to change everything about my own identity just so someone else can like me. And that's not what we're supposed to do. God made all of us differently. And that means we are all human. That means not everyone's going to like you. which is awful. But you shouldn't worry about changing who you are when it comes to your worship so that others approve of you. Point number 3 is David worshiped with humility. Michael thought it was unbecoming of a king to act that way. David was a king, a warrior, a leader. He was a man's man, right? But most importantly, he was a son that had experienced God's favor throughout his whole life. And his worship showed it. His worship reflected that. David never became too important or too popular, too old or too distinguished to worship radically. He set aside all his titles when it came to worshiping the Lord.
That's good.
Regardless of your title, you will never be too important to worship God. Whether you're Heather Wallace, whether you're Cayman, whether you're Heath, no matter what your title is, President of the United States, like whatever your title is, senior pastor of a megachurch, you will never have too big of a title, too important of a title to not worship the Lord with everything you have. Silence the voice in your head that is telling you to worship God, that worshiping God radically is somehow below you. I think when we get around our friends, sometimes we go, well, they're not lifting their hands, so I'm not going to do it. They're not jumping, so I'm not going to. Well, guess what? When you're standing before the Lord, you're not standing with your friend.
Right.
So you're not going to be able to say, well, God, they didn't jump. No, he has different standards for you than he does for other people. He knows what's uncomfortable for them, and he knows what's uncomfortable for you. And he wants to see where you're going to take your worship. David told Michael he was even willing to look foolish in his own eyes. He was willing to look foolish even to himself. There was no such thing as going overboard in worship to him. You can't worship God too passionately, too enthusiastically, or fervently. You know, I feel like Pastor Thomas asked me to talk about this one because worship is one that I feel we have felt in general together that our youth group can go deeper in. I've seen you guys go deeper in worship at youth camps and at youth conventions and, at fine arts and all these different things when we're in the crowds, when we're in the hype of TYM. But worship is more than just TYM.
That's right.
Worship is about God and about the favor that he has on us. Point number 4 is David worshiped because God chose him. David worshiped the Lord radically, without pride or thoughts of others, but why? Verse 21 says, I was dancing before the Lord because he chose me above your father and all his family. He appointed me as the leader of Israel and the people of the Lord, so I celebrate before the Lord. David's radical worship was rooted in the wonder that God chose him and that God's favor was upon him. Years after he slayed a giant, he remembered that God saw him in the field as a kid, and God chose him. Even as an adult in his life, he still worshiped with everything he had, because he remembered as a kid in a field, God still chose him. And God still chooses him every single day. We should never lose the feeling of wonder that God chooses us, that he saw us, the treasure that was in us, before we even saw it in ourselves. Radical worship is a result of someone who realizes the favor that God has on them, and since before they even took their first breath, God still showed favor on you. The amazement of God's favor that David experienced as a young man stayed with him all of his days, and that is why he worshipped.
That's right.
That is why he worshipped undignified. That is why he gave it all. That's why he didn't care what his wife said, what anybody else said. That's why he put his title aside as king and said, I'm still going to worship. I don't care if I'm king. I don't care if I lose the job as king. I'm still going to worship the Lord. When you realize that God's hand has been upon your life this whole time, it doesn't just affect your teenage years, but it'll affect the rest of your life.
Yeah, that's good.
So we're going to come to a close, but we're going to before I actually have Heath play this music, I want you guys, we're going to put into action what we're talking about. Because it's easy to say these things, But it's one thing to say it, and it's another thing to do it. And now, I'm not expecting you to all come up here and just start dancing and mosh pitting like David did. That's not authentic. It's you asking God, what do I need to do? How can I step out of my comfort zone? How can I give you my all because you have shown favor on me? So everyone close your eyes real quick. Think about the fact that God's favor has been on your life since the very beginning. Consider all the ways that God has shown a favor throughout your life. Maybe He saved you. Most of us are saved in this room, if not all of us. Maybe He's forgiven you of sins. He's shown mercy and grace on you. There's been times and times where I have sinned and I've done the same sin and I have answered the same altar call for the same sin, and yet I go back and I struggle with the same sin. And yet God still shows mercy. He still shows grace. He still says, even though you can't seem to let that go, I'm still going to show grace on you. He shows grace even when we don't deserve it. He called you out and He set you apart for a purpose. Think of all the things God has brought you out of. Maybe it's depression. Maybe it was suicidal thoughts. Maybe it's such bad insecurity that you purged or threw up and did things so that way you can fit a certain mold to meet your friends' ideas of who you should be. Maybe it was that you decided you just wanted someone to love you, so you were to give all of yourself to someone who didn't deserve you. Maybe it wasn't even something so bad, because I know some of us, sometimes pastors cover such of the big sins that the little sins, we say, well, God never covered, they never covered what I was struggling with, so I'm good. But maybe it's something as simple as you just chose not to read your Bible because you're too tired. Maybe He forgave you from questioning Him. Think of all the blessings you have because of Him. You have a roof over your head. You have oxygen in your lungs. You have a church family who loves you. You have friends who support you. We often think of the negative things. We think of everything that we don't have and everything that's happening to us and all the bad people that hate us, but yet we don't think and bless God and thank Him for all the blessings He's poured upon us. Now consider what your life of worship should look like in light of all these things. I know some of you are thinking about a specific situation right now that God saved you from. That God literally reached out His hand and pulled you out of. Does your worship look even to the favor that the Lord has upon you? Does it show the crazy amount of favor you have on your life? Does it show how God has been super merciful on your life? Does it show your testimony? Does your worship show that? Does it show how powerful God is? Does it show the powerful impact that He's had on your life? What kind of praise should you offer to the Lord? Heath, go ahead and press that song on. I got 2 songs, and in just a minute, I don't want it to be like a rush. You guys come up here and I'm forcing you to do something, because if that's what you got out of this, you got it wrong. What it should be is that we can't stay in a spot where we're not showing God our true self. We're not worshiping with everything we have like David did. What kind of praise should you offer to the Lord? How should you respond? And will you do it? I want you to come up whenever you feel like it, and I want you to worship Him authentically and radically for all He's done.